Hi, and welcome to Explorations in Economic History. This is Explorations in Economic History and Thought Socialism, and today we are talking about whether Marx and the Bolsheviks actually intended for socialism to be a planned economy. So we will be asking whether the Bolsheviks intended to centrally plan the economy, or whether they were more interested in eliminating money and introducing workers' cooperatives without any kind of a planned economy underlying it. And that question will then give us insight in order to ask the further questions about whether the Soviet experience matched the predictions of its advocates, whether there were economic policy issues faced by Lenin and his workers' government once they came into power and once they put into place this planned economy, and what went wrong and why did Lenin retreat to the new economic policy, and so on and so forth. So Marx argued in Critique of the Gotha Program, is where the quote comes from. Marx argued that a dictatorship of the proletariat would be necessary in the transition period between capitalism and communism during the socialist or lower phase of communism period. So the famous quote goes, "Between capitalist and communist society, there lies the period of the revolutionary transformation of the one into the other. Corresponding to this is also a political transition period in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat." What would the dictatorship look like? Is Marx talking about a totalitarian dictator, a Pinochet-style dictator, some kind of, military tyrant? No. Dictatorship of the proletariat means the dictatorship, so-called, of all the workers coming together to govern a society with commonly owned resources. So it means a workers' state. A dictatorship meaning that the workers could decide how everything was done, but it would be the workers, all of the workers, that would be deciding this. So when communism was realized, the state would wither away. But what state was it that would wither away? So it's some kind of a workers' state with workers owning the resources that would wither away. It would not be a bourgeois state, because you cannot go directly from capitalism to communism. So this in-between state that must wither away is a workers' state, a dictatorship of the workers. Well, so does this mean that Marx advocated planning and that Lenin planned to plan the economy? Did they see communism as emerging naturally from some kind of dialectical transformation as a spontaneous act, did they imagine that it was one spontaneous order turning into another? Or did they see some kind of planning as necessary as part of this transformation? Well, we can take a step back and talk for a moment about Marx's ideas about the concentration that he saw in capitalist economies as they developed. So Marx believed that competition was unsustainable in developed capitalism because competition would naturally lead towards concentration. As capitalists expanded production and their ties to the state increased and entrenched the capitalist power, production would fall to fewer and fewer, larger and larger firms. And Engels wrote about this in Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. He said, "The violent concentration of capital that occurs during crises through the ruin of many large and still a greater number of small capitalists." He also talked about the state being entwined with producers, and he spoke about the trusts that came out of this, state-backed trusts, and the freedom of competition slowly erodes and changes into its opposite, into monopoly, he said. So Marx and Engels were talking about corporatism or state capitalism. So the state capitalist monopolies were firms tightly linked to the capitalist state, and the bourgeois state protected the capitalist interests and waged war on its behalf. This they called international imperialist competition. And this was some of what Trotsky and Bukharin and Lenin were each in turn talking about when they spoke about the Leviathan imperialist state, or the state capitalist at the pinnacle of the development of capitalism, and how it became this Leviathan state, in Bukharin's words. So this capitalism, this state capitalist economy, is what they saw as dialectically transforming into the socialist and then communist society. And David Ramsey Steele argues that it was because centralization of industry wasn't happening on its own that Bolsheviks and other Marxists began to turn to the wartime economies of, for example, Germany during World War I, which Lenin looked to as an example of state monopoly capitalism or state capitalism. And it was the wartime administrative controls that Lenin pointed to and said, look, this is an example of planning the economy. And although that they're planning it under a capitalist, rule by exploiters, we could do the same planning, but do it with worker control. So, the production without any definite plan of capitalist society capitulates to the production upon a definite plan of the invading socialist society. That's how Engels put it in Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. He tended to be a lot more straightforward and spelled things out a lot more clearly than Marx. However, we can see some indication that Marx believed in planning as well. For example, in State and Revolution, Lenin spoke about the Paris Commune and Marx's analysis of it. And he said that the Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917 continue the work of the Paris Commune. And then Lenin goes on to quote Marx and Marx's analysis of the Paris Commune in order to describe what he was planning for as the workers took control after the Russian Revolution. So he wrote this between the sort of bourgeois revolution, the first revolution, and the revolution that he would lead, or the coup, when the workers would take complete control. So Lenin quoted from Marx's The Civil War in France about the Paris Commune, and in a section describing what would replace the bourgeois state, Lenin said, he quoted Marx and used the same terms that he used about all officials without exception should be subject to recall at any time and have their salaries reduced to the level of workmen's wages, to the level of ordinary workmen's wages. So in both cases, both Marx and Lenin were speaking about the officials of the workers' state, which in fact they meant, all of the workers in the workers' state, who would all be officials of the state because the workers would own all the means of production, so everyone would be working for the state, and all of their wages would be set centrally because they would be all set to be at the level of the ordinary worker. So both Marx and Lenin were speaking about a state in which everyone worked for the state, a society and economy in which everyone worked for the state, and everyone received wages that were determined centrally by the workers' state. So they were both speaking about a centrally planned economy. Also, before coming to power, Lenin made an argument that planning was necessary to save Russia from the conditions that it faced at that time, which were, having been destroyed, having the economy been destroyed by World War I and by revolution. And Lenin argued that only control, supervision, accounting, regulation by the state, introduction of a proper distribution of labor power, etc., would be able to save the economy, to combat catastrophe and famine. And finally, after coming to power, Bukharin spoke about planning and its importance, and he said that communism must develop the social forces of production to a maximum, and likewise the productivity of social labor. And to this end, he said, our ideal solution to this is centralized production, methodically organized in large units, and in the final analysis, the organization of the world economy as a whole. So they were very clear, especially once in power, about the importance of planning, how it would increase productivity, and how it was the only solution for Russia, for the Soviet Union, both in terms of productivity and in terms of ideology.